Hey, Katie. We have The Sign of the Twisted Candles. We are on chapter 20, last chapter. Startling Confession. At that moment, a muffled scream reached the ears of Nancy's father and Mr. Hill.
"What was that? It came from upstairs in the house!"
Mr. Drew exclaimed.
"Quick! Inside!"
He unlocked the front door, and the two men rushed in. Snapping on lights as they went, the two ran to the second floor.
"No one here,"
said Mr. Drew. He led the way to the tower room, 2 steps at a time. The door to it was closed, but not locked. An intruder had evidently opened it. Mr. Drew burst in, followed by the banker. An amazing and uncanny scene met their gaze. Nancy Drew's head and shoulders were framed in the window as if she were standing on air. Frank Jemmett's arms were thrust through the opening in the act of pushing Nancy backward. The young detective's hands were clutching the man's wrists to prevent her from falling. Carol's arms were clasped around Jemmett's waist, straining to pull him away from Nancy. And Mrs. Jemmett was just in the act of bringing down the heavy willow reed across Carol's shoulders.
"Stop!"
thundered Carson Drew, leaping forward. With one sweep of his arm he sent Mrs. Jemmett reeling aside. Raymond Hill grabbed her husband, while Mr. Drew reached out the window to rescue Nancy. He was not a moment too soon, for the ladder on which she was standing slipped from under her and crashed to the ground. Mr. Drew helped Nancy through the window, while Carol guarded the door toward which her foster mother had dashed.
"Let me go!"
Jemmett croaked. He was being half-choked by Mr. Hill's grasp. The banker released his prisoner, who staggered into a corner, clutching his throat.
"Nancy, are you all right?"
her father asked. "Yes, Dad, but you came just in the nick of time." "Oh, Nancy," Carol cried out, "you were almost hurt because of me. It was my scream that gave you away."
"But it was what warned us," Mrs. Drew told her. "Raymond, please go down to the phone booth and call State Police headquarters. Ask them to send troopers to take charge of 2 prisoners.
As Mr. Hill went off, Nancy turned to Jemmett. "Where's the watchman?"
"See if you can find out,"
was the surly reply. "I can answer that," Carol spoke up. "My foster father punched him. While the man was kind of groggy, Mr. Jemmett tied his arms and legs and gagged him. He's in the big closet under the stairs on the first floor." "I'll get him," Nancy volunteered. "Come on, Carol." The guard, shamefaced at having been trapped a second time, eagerly took charge of the 2 prisoners. While waiting for the state police car to arrive, the Jemmetts made a full confession. Many of Nancy's hunches had been correct. Jemmett also said he had put the snake in the box to frighten any burglars. By this time, the police had arrived and the Jemmetts were in custody. After they had gone, Mr. Hill asked,
"Now what do we do? Shall we call it a night?"
Nancy answered quickly, "No, let's not. I want to phone all the beneficiaries of Asa Sidney's estate and ask them to come here at once." The others turned questioning eyes toward Nancy. She went on, "During my search in the tower room, I came across a hidden letter from Mr. Sidney marked for Carol Whipple, to be opened in the presence of Peter Boonton, Jacob Sidney, Anna and Bess Marvin, and Louise and George Vane. I think it will explain why he left most of his money to you, Carol." "Oh!" the girl exclaimed. "Do you mind if they come?" Nancy asked. Carol sighed. "We may as well get it over with." Nancy went to the telephone. In turn, each one she called was glad to hear that Carol had been found, and was shocked to learn of the Jemmett's cruelty. The relatives demurred, however, about coming to the inn at that late hour, but finally consented. So initially they didn't really want to come, but they agreed. "Carol, when did you last eat?" Nancy asked when she rejoined the others. "Not for a long time. I lost my appetite." "Then let's have a bite before the Sidneys and Boontons begin to arrive." Carol managed to smile. "I guess I'll need some strength. Nancy, I let the Jemmetts into your house and they threatened me and made me come here. How can you ever forgive me?" Nancy smiled. "You're already forgiven. Now let's look for some food." The kitchen cupboards had little in them, but Nancy found canned chocolate milk, potted ham, and some relatively fresh bread. She made a sandwich and heated the milk. Carol had just finished eating when the Marvins arrived. Within a few minutes all the relatives had assembled.
"Miss Drew, your reasoning for getting me out here this late," said Jacob Sidney, "had better be good."
I'm sure it will be, Nancy replied. Will you all please come up to the tower room? Carol grabbed Nancy's hand as they ascended the steps. She was trembling. Don't be afraid, Nancy whispered. I have a hunch there's a wonderful surprise for you in the letter. Mr. Drew unlocked the door to the tower room, and the many candles were lighted. When everyone was seated, the lawyer briefly outlined what had happened since they had last been together, told of the recovered treasures, and the Jemmets' part in stealing some of Asa Sidney's property.
And now Nancy will show you where she found the letter to Carol, he concluded.
A great hush came over the room as his daughter walked to the desk table. She pushed the big Bible aside and pressed the secret spring. As the lid of the hidden compartment flew up, the onlookers gasped. There are many papers in here, Nancy said, but the letter on top is the one to be read now. She gave it to Carol, but the overwrought girl's hand shook so much she dropped the envelope.
So poor Carol's nerves are just shot.
Nancy, please read it for me, she begged. There was a pause as Nancy picked up the letter. Again, she gave Carol a chance to read it, but the other girl only shook her head. Please.
Poor thing's overwhelmed.
All right. Nancy opened the letter and began to read. My dear Carol, this letter is a confession of a stubborn, selfish old man. For many years I have known the secret of your identity, but have not revealed it for two reasons. The feud in my family, and the fact that I wanted to keep you near me. I have no direct descendants, but you are my great-grandniece. At that revelation there were exclamations of surprise in the room, and whisperings among the Boontons and Sidneys. Carol kept her head down, eyes closed. Her face was pale, and she sat perfectly still. Mr. Drew said,
Go on, Nancy.
There were only two people who ignored the senseless feud, and for this reason were ostracized from their families. They were John Boonton, brother of Anna Marvin and Louise Fane, and Helen Sidney, daughter of Jacob Sidney. When their families would not let them marry, they eloped, and later had a baby whom they named Carol, after my dear little girl who died. That baby is you, Carol, my dear. Suddenly Bess Marvin rushed to Carol. You're my cousin, she exclaimed, hugging the speechless girl. George ran forward.
And you're a Boonton. You're Carol Boonton.
Tears of joy streamed down Carol's cheeks. She smiled through them and looked at Nancy. Oh, Nancy, if it hadn't been for you, I might never have known this. Nancy hugged her new friend, while Mrs. Marvin said, I shall ask the Fernwood Orphanage to appoint us as foster parents. Mrs. Fane said,
I want to share in this.
Mr. Drew had risen and asked for silence.
There's more to the letter. Nancy, please finish it.
Everyone sat down again, and she went on. You will wonder how I learned all this. I was a director of the Fernwood Orphanage at the time you were brought there, Carol, by the rector of a nearby church. You were about 2 years old. He had found you near the altar, crying. A search for your parents proved fruitless. You were such a dear little thing, and reminded me so much of my own little girl. I asked that the orphanage change the name they had given you to Carol. The whole thing haunted me, and I began some private detective work. I found out that a little while prior to the rector finding you, there had been an automobile accident not far away. The couple in it were killed. They proved to be a Mr. and Mrs. John Boonton. A further search by me revealed that they were relatives of my wife, and among some papers they had left at a boarding house was a picture of you, Carol. Just as I was wondering what to do about revealing this secret, the Jemmets offered to become your foster parents. At a board of directors meeting, I said I would give my consent only if the Jemmets came to work here. You know the rest, Carol, and forgive me for being so selfish. I hope the fortune I am leaving you will more than offset any pain and privation I have caused you.
So like deprivation of stuff.
I love you very much, Carol. Asa Sidney. When Nancy stopped, all of Carol's relatives hurried to her side. Jacob Sidney put an arm around his new-found relative.
So I'm your grandfather, eh? Well, I must say that makes me very proud. Carol, please don't hold what I've said against me, and I don't want 1 penny of your inheritance. Nor I, added Peter Boonton. He made an apologetic grin. After all, I'm your great-uncle.
Carol found it hard to say anything, but finally she whispered, I can't believe it. Suddenly I have a grandfather, a great uncle, 2 lovely aunts, and 2 wonderful cousins, and a most marvelous friend." Her eyes searched the room for Nancy, who had disappeared. Mr. Drew had left too. But in a few minutes both came back, saying they had been on the telephone. "My dad has an announcement to make," she said, her eyes dancing. The lawyer addressed the group.
"We called the Fernwood Orphanage. Fortunately, the board of directors was having a late evening meeting. They agreed that since relatives of Carol's have been found who want her to make her home with them, the orphanage will waive any further claim."
A friendly argument between the Marvins and the Fanes followed. Both families wanted Carol to live with them. During the discussion, Nancy was wondering what her next mystery would be. It was a puzzling one, which was called Password to Larkspur Lane. "We've decided, Nancy," Bess announced, "that Carol's going to spend most of her time at boarding school and divide the rest between the Marvins and the Fanes."
"And I recommended that Carol learn judo," George said with a grin. "So if those horrible Jemmets should ever break jail, she'll know how to handle them."
Everyone laughed, and a thrill went through Nancy. The Boonton-Sydney feud was over. And that's the end of the book. I hope you enjoyed. I enjoyed reading it to you. And I'll see you for the next one. Love you.